Now, the second big argument that preterists will posit to argue for their early date of Revelation is going to be the temple of Revelation 11, 1 and 2. And I've mentioned this before in passing, but I want to do a little more detailed analysis of this just to show that it's not really a strong argument at all. So Robert Briggs has a quote where he says, "The apparent existence of the Jerusalem temple in Revelation 11, 1 and 2 is a paramount feature in support of the argument that the book was actually written during Nero's earlier reign." Okay, so in Revelation 11, there's actually 4 different views that argue about what the temple is. And the most common view, actually, among commentators in the past as well as the present, is that it's a symbolic view of the church. Okay, the temple represents the church, and the court of the temple in Revelation 11:2 represents the world and all who have compromised with it. Okay, and this has a lot going for it, at least as far as arguments go. I think G.K. Beale is, if you're looking for the best on this, I think Beale has the best defense of how this might work. I don't agree with him, obviously, but I think he's the most prominent defender, most articulate, really respect him and how he argues. And so he describes Revelation 11 as being a description of the church, described as a temple. And admittedly, the New Testament does describe the church as a temple. So there is a connection there, okay? Now, just for sake of time, I can't go down that rabbit hole because I really want to focus on preterism. But that is a worthy view to talk about, okay? But second of all, some people have held that it's a heavenly temple, okay? And this actually spans the different eschatological camps. They argue that it's a heavenly temple. And, there are references. Hebrews 8 comes to mind where there is a reference to a heavenly tabernacle, which is the pattern for the earthly tabernacle. So there is a possibility there, to be sure. But the final 2 views are the ones that we'll talk about. And so for preterists, they say, hey, this is a slam dunk that this is referring to the Herodian temple that's still standing prior to 70 AD. Okay. Now, what is appealed to, and Gentry, again, I'm using him a lot just because he's often viewed as the main proponent, or perhaps the best person who argues for preterism in Revelation. And one of the things that he would argue is that there's a similarity between Luke 21:24 and Revelation 11, 1 and 2. And so Luke 21:24, if we're to look at that, Luke 21:24 says, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." All right, that is a great verse. We should look at that for its eschatological ramifications at another time. But for our purposes, Revelation 11 does talk about there being trampling that takes place as well. So the big combined effort here is to see that Luke 21 mentions the city being trampled by Gentiles, and Revelation 11 mentions the holy city being trampled by the nations. But there are some big differences between the 2 texts, okay? In Revelation 11, there's a difference between the temple proper and the outer court, okay? So in Revelation 11:1, John is told to measure the temple and the altar and those who worship there. So he's assessing those. But then in verse 2, it says, "Do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So that's actually quite a bit difference. Is there in John's vision, verse 1 is something that gains God's approval. Okay, the altar, the temple have God's approval, and the people who are worshiping there. But the outer court of the temple is what has God's disapproval, and the nations are going to trample the holy city. Now, what's interesting about that, though, this is a major problem because Gentry, in dealing with this, and many preterists in trying to deal with this, have to employ an inconsistent hermeneutic. And remember, consistency is key in hermeneutics. I'll beat this drum till the day I die, but you want to be really consistent in how you're assessing things. And the thing that Gentry does, which is really inconsistent and difficult for me to understand why you would try to do this, is he sees verse 1 as symbolic and verse 2 as literal. All right. And I don't see how that works, but this is what he does, right? So in Revelation 11:1, he sees the temple and altar as symbolic of the church, of the people of God, etc. But then in verse 2, he takes it as literally as the real temple being destroyed by the Gentiles. All right. Now, it's also kind of tricky because he takes verse 1 as symbolic figurative. He takes verse 2 as literal, but then in verse 3, he splits it. And the 42 months is literal, but the two witnesses of Revelation verse 3 are not literal. They're symbolic of, the remnant Christian community that stays there. So if you're keeping track at home, 1 is symbolic, 2 is literal, 3 is symbolic and literal, wherever you want to make the division. Now, there's no indication in the text of any of those divisions, right? You are basically just deciding because you want to do that, you are making it figurative, or because you want to do that, you're making it literal. Okay. So that's kind of ridiculous. And maybe the best way to illustrate that would be playing Monopoly. That would be like us playing Monopoly, you and me, we're playing Monopoly. We'll invite some other people, and I just change the rules whenever I want. And I say, oh, I passed go. I collect $500. Oh, you passed go. Now I get to collect $500 again because you passed go. So what's the name of this game? The game is I win. I get to change whatever rules I want, and therefore I will win no matter what. So according to this standard, and I use that a little loosely, the standard that Gentry is employing, he can make the passage mean whatever he wants, whenever he wants, because there's no concrete standard of interpretation. That's why, this is, even though it's a very vocal minority, this kind of interpretation is a minority because people recognize it's very inconsistent. That's why the view of the symbolic temple being the church, even though I disagree with it, is at least more consistent, because as Beale goes through it and others, they're saying, yeah, this is all symbolic and all of these things are symbolic. You can't just pick and choose saying, yeah, this part is literal, this part is symbolic, this part's literal, this part's symbolic, okay? Just very, very haphazard, and I think definitive, shows the problem in trying to make that fit your view. But there's more, okay? So not only do you have that inconsistent view by Gentry trying to make Revelation 11 fit his preconceived notion of how it should work, but you also have other passages, or I should say other texts, which refer to the temple as operational or as existing, as it were, even though it had been destroyed. So remember, the big selling point here for the preterist viewpoint is that if Revelation 11 is talking about the temple, it cannot have been destroyed yet. Okay. But that actually is argued against by the existence of First Clement. Okay. First Clement is it's a very early work in church history, and it's not inspired, obviously, but it just gives a really tangible glimpse into what the early church thought and how they wrote their letters of encouragement, etc. And it's a quite lengthy letter, but there are some pertinent passages related to what we're talking about. And in First Clement chapter 41, verses 1 and 2, we read this, okay? Remember, this is First Clement 41. So he says, "Let each of you, brothers, in his proper order give thanks to God, maintaining a good conscience, not overstepping the designated rule of his ministry, but acting with reverence. Not just anywhere, brothers, are the continual daily sacrifices offered, or the free will offerings, or the offerings for sin and trespasses, but only in Jerusalem. And even there, the offering is not made in every place, but in front of the sanctuary at the altar, the offering having been first inspected for blemishes by the high priest and previously mentioned ministers." All right, so if you're paying attention at all to what's being said there, what he's saying is that, listen, we know Jerusalem is a special place. The altar and the sanctuary are there, and sacrifices are offered there. So based on that data, you might think, oh, wow, this was written before the temple was destroyed. Here's the thing. Again, almost unanimously, scholars date this late. In fact, they actually date it very similar to the time of Revelation. They date it around 95, 96 AD for a variety of purposes. We'll get into some of them. But again, almost, I can't give a percentage, but we're talking far and away, the majority of people who are dating this are dating it later. Now, Gentry has to kind of fight against the consensus on First Clement too. And he says, no, this has to be written prior to 70 AD because of this passage, because it talks about, the altar and the temple. And if it had been destroyed, why wouldn't Clement talk about it being destroyed? Now, this is a problem though, for the viewpoint, because if it is written after 70 AD, it shows that it's not so strong of an argument to say that, Revelation 11 would never talk about a temple if it had just been destroyed. Revelation would certainly mention the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of the temple if it had happened, but First Clement does neither of those things, okay? And so First Clement is actually a pretty significant part of the argument. But here's the thing, is that First Clement mentions explicitly the martyrdom of Paul and Peter, okay? And so that means that in order for Paul and Peter to have been martyred, 67, 68, that Clement is probably written, if Gentry is right, it has to be written in 69 AD exactly. Essentially, that's the only option, okay? So Gentry has his back up against the wall with Revelation. Now he put his back up against the wall with First Clement too, okay? But listen to this, all right? So in First Clement 5, 1-7, it says this: but to pass from the examples of ancient days, okay, so he calls these examples from the ancient days, let us come to those champions who live nearest to our time. Let us set us before us the noble examples which belong to our generation. So those are the two key phrases. He says that it's from ancient days and they belong to our generation, all right? So putting those together, you would expect it to be long ago in ancient days. You wouldn't, if Clement is writing in 69 AD, you wouldn't expect him to say, let's talk about the examples of ancient days if it was just last year, okay? And then specifically he mentions Peter and Paul being martyred. That's the examples that he's using there, okay? So again, he says ancient days and generation. Now, some people say, well, look, Clement couldn't have been too much later because generation would have to include, the time of the author or whatever. But listen, if we're writing it in 95, 96 AD, that's only 27 years after Paul and Peter are martyred. Okay, I mean that's all it would have to be for the person to be able to say, hey, this still took place in our generation. We were involved with that. I mean, if you think of all the 27-year-olds, they're still young men, right? But they could have been alive during that generation when Nero persecuted those individuals. And that seems to be what Clement is talking about. It's talking about the persecution that existed in Rome under Nero as if it had happened in the past, okay? And it would be really weird for Clement to say, hey, this was happened of ancient days, and these ancient days, were last year or whatever. It's like, that's a little strange. Plus, there are other details within the book itself. Okay, those are just the debated passages, but there are other details in the book which really show that there's something else going on here. So this is a quote from the dissertation by Hitchcock on the date of Revelation. He says, in First Clement, the Neronian persecution is an event of the past. So remember, Nero has to persecute prior to his death. That's obvious. So he's got to be, early to mid 60s. And so that Clement is treating that as in the past. And we also see that Peter and Paul were viewed as having died during that persecution. So that would have to put First Clement to AD 69, according to Gentry. Third, there's a reference to First Clement there's a reference in First Clement to emissaries from Rome to the Corinthian church. And they're described as those who from youth to old age have lived blamelessly among us. For believers, I'm still quoting Hitchcock here, for believers from Rome to have lived as Christians from youth to old age requires a date after the late 60s. All right, remember, so a whole lifespan is said to have existed by the author of Clement. And then fourth, the church at Corinth is called ancient. Okay, and that's in one of those sections. I think it might be chapter 47, if I remember correctly. The church at Corinth is said the ancient church at Corinth, which, if it's being written in 69 AD, it's less than 20 years old, or right around there at 20 years old. But if it's 95, 96 AD, it's about 50 years old. So again, ancient, what do words mean, right? If First Clement was written before 70 AD, the church at Corinth would not have reached its 20th anniversary by the time First Clement was composed. A period of less than 20 years hardly fits the adjective ancient. However, if First Clement was written in the late 90s, the church would have been almost 50 years old and would fit this description much better. All right, so that's what Hitchcock notes. Now, I also have a quote here from an individual by the name of Lawrence Wellborn, who wrote the entry in the Anchor Bible Dictionary for Clement. And he says the account of the deaths of Peter and Paul in chapter 5 is not that of an eyewitness. The presbyters installed by the apostles have died, according to chapter 44:2. So what he's noting there is that according to Clement, the apostles put elders in charge of the churches, and Clement said that they have already died. And the second ecclesiastical generation has passed as well, according to chapter 44, verse 3. And then he says that the church at Rome, which I think he means the church at Corinth, is called ancient, making the same point that Hitchcock has made. And then he says they're called ancient, and the emissaries from Rome are said to have lived blamelessly as Christians from youth to old age, making a similar point to Hitchcock as well. So notice what the cumulative evidence that Wellborn points out is that you have the apostles appointing elders, those elders have died, and the next generation has all come, into the fore here. It's very strongly indicative of a epistle that is written later in history, not right at the apostles' existence and martyrdom. And so he actually would say the epistle cannot have been written before the last decades of the first century. I think if he gives he spans it somewhere between 80 and 110 AD, I think, which is similar to what people would do with the Didache as well. So the two key points to all of this is that First Clement seems clearly written after 70 AD, which means that there's no problem talking about a contemporary description of the temple, even when it's already been destroyed. Okay, so that's the interesting component of Clement. He can write as if the temple were still standing, talking about how Jerusalem has that privilege, etc., but the temple was not in existence anymore. And so that kind of discredits the whole idea that, oh, well, if John mentions the temple, then it has to have been destroyed. Okay. Also, when people say, oh, but John didn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem, that would be just unheard of or unknown. Well, guess what? Clement doesn't mention that either. And again, almost everybody says that Clement is dated later because of those factors which we talked about. And so if you're a preterist, your back is against the wall already with Revelation, and now you put your back against the wall with Clement, which it's similar to in the last episode that we were talking about with Revelation. You have certain preterists who try to change the date of Philippians too, because all this data starts not to fit their system. And because it's so crucial that Revelation fits their dating scheme. Remember, the preterist viewpoint is inherently tied to an early date of Revelation. And so again, there's a lot of bias involved there. But like we're showing, I think that there's a lot of data points which would go against the slam dunk arguments that they make, right? And then I think this is the strongest argument. I spent more time on that, but I think really the strongest argument, which I've mentioned before, is that Revelation 11, 1 and 2 talks about the temple and measuring the temple, but Ezekiel 40 to 48 talks about it as well. And I think this is the strongest argument because if Ezekiel 40 to 48 predicts a future temple, which I think it does, then we would expect John to be aware of that, right? And John would be aware of the prophetic picture. And so any mention of the temple, he wouldn't be surprised of that, right? And by the way, I think it's important because a lot of people don't understand that there is actually a lot in the Old Testament prophets about a future temple. I've written blog posts on this. You can search for those if you want. But the reality is a lot of people just think Ezekiel 40 to 48 is the only passage that talks about a future temple. But there are a lot. You got Haggai 2, Isaiah 2, you have Malachi 3, Zechariah 6. All these talk about a future temple, okay? And so it's not just Ezekiel to 40, 48, but any fair reading of the Old Testament talks about there being a future temple that is instituted after a destruction. And so I think John who's one of the most reliant upon the Old Testament prophecies of any New Testament author, would fit well with that. Okay. And so not only that, but in Ezekiel 40 to 48, you have Ezekiel measuring a temple that doesn't exist. It's a vision, right? And so John does the same thing. Very easy to match with that, right? So I just think there's a lot of correspondences there. And Hitchcock has like a massive part in his dissertation on that. And I just summarized some of that. I just think it's very straightforward. And so I think that Revelation 11 is talking about a future temple, which would match with the Old Testament prophecies very clearly. Again, if we just read our Old Testaments more, we probably wouldn't have as much of a problem in understanding some of these prophetic passages in Revelation. Okay. But again, I would emphasize too, for my amillennialist brethren, that I do appreciate their consistency in trying to be symbolic in all of Revelation 11 instead of the picking and choosing that happens from the preterist viewpoint a lot of times. So be that as it may.